Hey folks, welcome to Moonshift Audio. In last week's video I took you through the production of a hyperpop track in the style of A.G. Cook, and this week I'm going to go through the entire mixdown. This is quite an interesting one, and in this video I'm going to be covering a few things, including how to make use of mid-side EQ to help things fit around each other in a busy mix, the challenges of mixing a track with almost no send effects, and just how much of a difference it can make to your mix if you choose complementary sounds at the arrangement stage. I had a request on the last video to hear the track in full, so I'm going to play it from start to finish now. It's probably also quite useful to you as a reference if you're looking to learn what went into this mix. If you're working on hyperpop or any adjacent genre and you'd like to work with me as a producer or a mix engineer, or you'd like a bit of support with one of your tracks, then you can get in touch with me at moonshifaudio.com. Or if you're working on your mixing and you'd like a video just like this one for one of your own tracks, then you might be a good fit for my Mix Exploder service. There's a link to that down below, but for now let's jump into Cubase and take a look at this mixdown. Alright, so here we are in Cubase and let's just start at the beginning. So the track starts off with this arpeggiated sequence that's made up of 3 layers, and the first layer is this FM8 instrument. It's got a couple of sound effects and a couple of inserts. So start off with, this is the raw sound. And I just wanted to give that a little bit more presence. So I put a decapitator on with just 2% drive. That's on the bass setting. Just gives it a little bit more weight. And then I threw in a Pro Q3. So I want this to be much more sort of mid-heavy than it is. It's got quite a lot of high end, but this is kind of filling out the middle of the track. I didn't want it to be too sparkly, and I've rolled off the lows. Then sends wise, we're sending it to the realm verb, which we looked at in the production video, adding this crazy sort of like whining effect in the background and this filtered delay. So we're just going to go and check out those buses now. The realm verb, we've obviously got the classic Abbey Road reverb trick, rolling off the lows and the highs before we get into that reverb, the reverb itself, and then another EQ, because it's such a weird sound, right, this reverb. Let's just listen a bit further on. Taking out some of the mud and also some of the high frequencies, which if I emphasize them, slightly weird kind of resonances. I just wanted to pull some of those back to make it a bit more subtle, that effect. The filtered delay is just an echo boy with a filter after it, which is exactly what I showed in last week's production video. So we can start looking at the second layer that makes up this sound. And this is where things start to get a little bit more interesting in terms of the panning. So this is bypass, this EQ now. You can hear there's a little bit of unusual sort of sub information, but what I'm trying to do with this mix is to get everything to fit really neatly around each other. And so I'm using a bit of mid-side EQ, and I'm putting a bit of a boost just in the mid-range, just above 1K for that nice bit of clarity, and I'm putting a scoop again only in the mid-range around that sort of 3K area where you can often find quite a lot of harshness. But what this still allows is for all of this to come out in the sides. So if you listen to the sides, not much of a change. So we've got that lovely kind of like metallic quality out to the sides. But in the center, it becomes a bit more sort of, a bit more body rather than that kind of harsh top end. And if we layer that, just starting to get those layers working. And if we move on to the third layer, you'll see that actually I've done no processing at all. This one is sort of quite far back in the mix. So it just sits behind. But you do notice it when it's gone. One thing I noticed when I was working on this track is that there are quite a few things here which don't have any processing on them at all, and just how much you can do just with level. Like just pulling something back on a fader will send it neatly to the back, and you'll start to find that sometimes things start to fit around each other really nicely with no need for EQing at all if you get the levels right. And it's always a good idea when you're starting a mix to just leave everything untouched and just balance the faders. Maybe do a bit of panning, that can be useful, but literally just doing a faders only mix is a really nice way to work out how much work you need to do. It's easy to start thinking, oh, I need to pull out all the lows from that, or I need to like boost the highs on that or it's not going to cut through. But if you do your faders balance first, you might find that actually things are fitting a lot better than you thought. The next element to come into this track is the voice synth that sounds like this. Now, I wanted this to be really, really upfront. So I've put a lot of kind of like low end in, a bit of presence, and then I've gone really, really hard on a fresh air. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, you'll know that I feel quite strongly about this plugin, and I think it's often overused. And you could probably quote me in saying I never turn it more than about 20%. Well, there's always an exception. So here we go. 100 on the high band and 92% on the low band. And it really does have that kind of horrible, artificial sparkle, which is exactly what this kind of voice cries out for on the kind of hyperpop scene. Massive difference there. If we listen to that in the mix, Yeah, it can sort of hold its own against that very kind of bright metallic synth in the background there. And so this plugin is basically taking care of some EQ and a lot of saturation. So I don't need any other saturation on that. When we get to the next section of the track where that voice patch is duplicated and panned hard left and hard right, I actually did find that it needed something more in the kind of like upper harmonics to help it cut through, because whereas this initial instance of the voices is panned dead center, when we start to blow it out to the sides, we're really suddenly competing with the upper frequencies, that kind of 3K area on that metallic sounding synth. Let's just have another quick listen to that, where if you remember, I cut the mids in that harshness zone, but all of that kind of high-end presence is very much still present at the sides. So now when we bring in the voices, we are actually directly fighting for that same space in the sides of the mix. So a little bit of extra saturation really, really helps it to cut through. So I'm going to turn off both of these decaps. And I'll bring them in. See, I'm driving them like, not like into the red, I'm not smashing it, but there's a little bit there. And what I was kind of aiming for was just enough. You can hear there it's sounding audibly distorted. If you pull that back, just getting a bit more kind of harmonic content, but without it sounding too sort of driven. And that's just what I felt it needed to just cut through the mix in the way that I would have liked. The next element to come in is the bass, so we'll take a quick look at that. So I mentioned in last week's production video that the bass is made up of 2 layers. There's the serum, which is just a really, really simple saw and sine patch. No effects in here. And no processing of any kind on that. It's just to sit behind the main bass that sounds like this. This is a DX7 bass patch, and I've done a bit of processing on there. So to start with, I've got an instance of trash on this sort of bass enhancer preset, which I've tweaked a bit. So this is dry, and this trash patch only affects everything above 300 Hertz, or 302. But it's quite a big difference. It's actually quite driven. But in the context of the mix, it doesn't actually sound as rough as it really is when you solo it. Minimal EQing here. I've just scooped out a little bit of the mud, and this is just a sort of like little bit of kind of mid-range presence. Can hear it just tightens it up a little bit. And following that, we've got a clipper. Love standard clip, and I love the interface here where you really get to see what you're taking off. Just could probably even pull that back even more. It is adding just a little bit of high-end harshness, but given how much we're actually able to clip off of that, I think it's well worth it in terms of our headroom. Now the bass sort of quite happily chugs along like that for the entire track. We're starting to bring in some of the drums at this point, so we can take a look at the clap. There's actually a reasonable amount going on here. So here's the clap dry. And we've got an EQ. Just brightening that up. We want this super kind of sparkly, hyped kind of hyperpop sound that we're going for. It was just a bit too dry. So we've got Valhalla Room, drop straight on the track. You can see I'm just automating the mix on that to come in. Then Decapitator. Distorting the reverb as well as the dry drum. And you can hear that decap is bringing out a little bit of kind of like ugliness in the low end, which I'm pulling out here. I'll just turn off these upper bands so you can hear what I was hearing. It's a kind of horrible, boxy sort of clumping. And that just clears it up really nicely. Then we've got even more presence at the 1K and 4K area. And a stereo enhancer, doing the opposite of what you might think, I'm actually pulling this back more towards mono. 20% stereo width. Because I want this to be really focused. So this mix, I'm trying to be really considered when it comes to the stereo image. As I'll talk about a bit later, everything is very, very dry. There's not really much in the way of sound effects. I haven't got these sort of like normal bank of kind of like reverbs and delays that I can use to push things back and forth, because that's just not really the way that AG tracks kind of sound to me. So it was a bit of a challenge to kind of play around with the stereo image and get things how I wanted. So I'm using mid-side EQ, and I'm using this kind of like stereo enhancer to really kind of like tuck the snare drum, the claps and their reverb into the middle to leave space at the sides for the elements that I really want to be there. And following that stereo enhancer, we've got another instance of standard clip. And again, you can see we're clipping that pretty hard, but it doesn't have a noticeable impact on the sound. And that's a really, really useful thing to do. I'm a big fan of clippers on things like claps and snares. Drums in general, it's great. You can sort of shave off some of that transient energy if that's eating into your headroom. But claps and snares in particular, and particularly in something with a kind of 4-to-the-floor drum beat, because that kick drum is going to be taking up a lot of headroom in your mix. And if you're layering up a clap with every kick, then that's going to be seriously like bunching together. So every kind of dB that you can get back of your headroom is really going to help you, especially if you got, you start thinking about your master bus chain and maybe got a limiter on there. I'm sure you will eventually. And what this is going to help to do is to stop these kick and clap impacts from just smashing into your limiter and causing that to go crazy, when really you want that to be working on the body of the track rather than just these transients that are poking up out of the mix. There are a couple of other elements that come into the track at this point. We get this crazy FM sound, and if I just bypass all the effects, it sounds like this. So the first thing I did was chuck a decapitator at it, just to kind of add some of those upper harmonics, because what I'm really going to do is to massively, massively brighten up this sound. I don't want it to be this kind of like muffled, low-level bubbling. I want this to be quite a sizzly kind of sound. So we're getting some quite extreme effects going on here, and the EQ is a big, big part of that. So you can see here, I'm massively rolling off. I'm using quite a steep filter, 18 dBs an octave. We could probably even pull that higher if we wanted. And I'm taking off literally everything below about 600 Hertz. And then an enormous, great wide boost in the mid-range there. That's 20 dB, that's enormous. And then I was just pulling out a little bit of the very, very top end and a bit of the harshness there. So massively changing that. I put a chopper on that, but just to help kind of stop that from becoming too present, and a stereo enhancer really summing this down to mono. So from that, with everything bypassed, and that's adding a really nice bit of high-end energy to the track, especially because we don't have anything like hi-hats. The other element at this stage is a duplicate of the voices. No EQ on these, but they are going to this filter group with the automated filter that we looked at last week and the chopper. But there's a little bit of EQ on this just to roll off the lows, but really the kind of EQ is being done by the filter in this instance. So now we're pretty much ready to get into the drop. And this is where we start to really see how everything fits together. So at this stage, we've got our arpeggiated line, which is just sort of filling out the mid-range. You remember that I was really doing a lot of boosting in the sort of 1K area. Obviously the bass sits underneath that. We've got our crazy FM thing bubbling away. Again, if I was to undo the effects on that, just disappears into the low end. We've got these filtered voices with the filter really quite open now, so they're sizzling up the sides really nicely. And the kick drum comes in for the drop, and we can take a quick look at that. It's quite a rough, probably already a bit distorted, that kick drum sample, but I've thrown a decap on it just because I really want to rough this up. And then I've got a Pro Q, scooping out some mud here, taking out some of that kind of like harshness in the top end, and adding in a little boost, like 4 dBs, well, reasonable, to get that really thumping low end. That's what I'm taking out there. That's a really horrible boxiness at 350 Hertz. If you want a good starting point for like kind of go-to frequencies when it comes to EQing a kick drum, as well as quite a few other elements, I've got a free EQ cheat sheet that I made. There's a link to download that in the description of the video. Something that's worth mentioning is that there is no side chaining or any other kind of interrelational processing going on between the kick and the bass in this track. So for this mix, I've used no ducking of any kind. The bass isn't sort of being pumped out the way. There's no side chain soothe going on. It's just fitting around each other. And I think it's easy to get caught up in the relationship between the kick and the bass. And for sure, I get it. You know, like the very, very low end is the most kind of crowded area of the mix. It's really easy for things to kind of fight for position down there. I know I've been guilty of this as well, but it's easy to sort of think you have to always pump things out the way. There has to be some kind of side chaining, ducking, side chain soothe, or at the very least some kind of like complementary EQ. But let's take a look at the EQs for the kick and the bass side by side for this track. So I've got here my EQ on the kick that we just looked at, and I've pulled up again the EQ that was on the bass, and you'll see here there's nothing going on in the low end at all, no sort of like scooped out little bit to make room for the kick. But if we play them together, it just works. There's probably a bit of masking going on there, but it doesn't matter, masking can help. A phrase that I heard recently that I really like is, don't try and fix problems that don't exist, just wasting your time. And I'm really happy with how the low end of this track sounds. It's worth mentioning as well that, you know, A.G. Cook doesn't have super bass heavy tracks. He's not like really warm, full low end. Everything's quite scooped. So there is a bit more space down there than perhaps you might otherwise get in another style of music. We bring in this bass sequence and bit more mid-side work going on this. So you can see I'm scooping out some of the kind of presence from the mid-range and putting a kind of low-end, reasonable amount of boost in the sort of low mids to the sides. So if we hear this without, rolling off the lows, kind of pushing this mid-range area out to the sides because there's not so much in that space in the sides. It's all kind of like sizzly 3K and up out to the sides at the moment, and taking some of that kind of harshness area out of the mids to allow room for things like the clap and those vocals. Got these additional snares coming in now. Nothing particularly exciting going on here, just a bit of EQ, a tiny bit of a boost, and rolling off some of the very, very highs on that fast snare. Just giving it a tiny bit of its own space in the frequency spectrum there. And with these crazy snares, I've got this Echo Boy, which I've automated the bypass on. We looked at that in the production video, rolling off all the lows. And again, pulling this down to 20% width. These are sending to a snare verb, which is a Valhalla room. I really love this snare lively small room preset, and we're scooping out like everything below 2K there. Just to get this really kind of sparkly kind of reverb effect. So we've got the bit crush voices coming in, and there's nothing much going on there. The actual instrument track is duplicated from the previous voices, so there's nothing new there. And this is literally just a bit crusher with a big mid-range boost and the lows rolled off. What we do get at this point is that new ARP line played by the DX7. And all I'm doing there is rolling off the lows. It's mostly in the reverb, really. The bass sequence. Bass is coming back in, we've got the clap. The voices will be coming back in a second, as well as the kick. And that's pretty much the mix. I think what's worth mentioning is just how few plugins there are. You know, there's a couple of tracks that have got like 3 or 4, but really this mix, you know, I've got a round verb which is on 1 element, a delay which is on 2 elements, and a snare verb which is only on a few snares. So we've not got a lot in the way of effects. A couple of groups, but really like the processing on this is quite minimal, really. If you go through here, we've got so many tracks that just have 1 or 2 effects on them. So just as a bit of an experiment, I've been through and I have turned off all of the processing for all of these tracks. I haven't turned off the bit crusher because that's quite a sort of crucial part of that bass sound. Similarly, I haven't turned off the bit crusher or the filter on these 2 groups, and I've left the sensing. But what I have done is turned off basically every EQ, every bit of saturation on all of the main elements of the track. And I'm going to play this for you now. Now, I think that's really interesting. Like, okay, some of the levels are not exactly how I might choose to have them, but the track does work, I'd say, pretty well. And what that means for me is that it's well arranged. The sounds that have been chosen to go into that mix are complementary, they work well together. And so actually, when it comes to the mix down, you're not doing all the heavy lifting. Sounds fit around each other quite well. Think back to the kick and the bass where I didn't even have to do any scooping. Just the kick drum sample and that bass tone are complementary. And if you can start to build your productions and your arrangements in that way, then you'll probably find that your mixes start to improve without you having to actually get better at mixing. I think that's about it for this week, but please do like and subscribe for more tips, tricks, resources and downloads from me at Moonshift Audio. If you're mixing or producing music in this style and you'd like a bit of feedback, I'm currently offering free feedback videos. All you need to do is visit moonshiftaudio.com, send me a message with a link to your track, I'll give it a listen, and I'll get back to you with a short video to give you my thoughts on the sort of broad strokes of what's working, what's not, and any areas that I think you can improve. I'll look forward to hearing from you. Till next time.